Hello, Regent Park. My name is Minerva Navaska. Please welcome Max Mishler, a history professor from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Max. How are you doing today?
I am great. Thank you for having me.
Let's go back to the very beginning. What can you tell us about the histories of the police and where they originated from?
Ah, it's a bigger question than you might even imagine, right?
Uh,
Because what you're really asking is, or one of the ways I interpret your question is,
mhm,
how did we come to a place where we have a group of people in a society that are deputized in some way as judge, jury, and executioner?
mhm,
They are endowed with the right to kill people,
mhm,
right? That's in some ways kind of odd. Most of us don't have that right. And so and police officers do. So the question is, well, how did they get that right? And what is this history of police? And I would say there's two histories to keep in mind. And they're related, but a little bit different.
mhm,
One is a history of police, which we might be able to trace to the kind of European medieval city. And the reason why there's a kind of connection between police and cities is that cities were one of the places, particularly in medieval Europe, where people would arrive and depart, and there were lots of people. So you couldn't really know who was in a city, right? You couldn't keep, if you're on a farm or in a farming village, people know other people in the community. They know who lives where. And when
mhm,
someone comes in from out of town, everyone notices it. But
mhm,
in the city, you can't. And so one of the origins of modern police is having a force that can protect calm, peace, right? Or what they call public peace, protect property, another key thing, protect order in a
mhm,
place where not everyone is known.
mhm,
So that's one kind of genealogy of the modern police. And you see this with, when people don't follow the rules, for example, around social distancing, right? They bring in the police to assert order. When people riot after a soccer match, they bring in the police to assert order.
mhm,
When there's a whole range of kind of human disturbances that the police are sort of sent to address. But there's another history of policing, one that's very tied to the history of slavery and bound labor.
mhm,
I'm using slavery and bound labor intentionally to say that both slavery, enslavement of African peoples, but also other forms of bound labor that involve, for example, Asian or Indian indentured labor, convicts of various kinds. But let's take the United States, for example, which is what I study and know best. In a place like Canada and the United States, you could also look at um, um, the sort of history of indigenous people, and I can talk about that a little bit, but I'm going to focus for a second on African Americans in the United States,
mhm,
because of course part of this stems from the fact of a white police officer executing a black man by putting his knee on his neck, right? And so the question then is like, well, is that new? No. Well, how old is it? And what is the relationship between racist policing and that other genealogy of policing I laid out about public order?
mhm,
So in the United States, from the 17th century through the 19th century, slavery, right, chattel slavery, was the bedrock of economic development, and particularly in the plantation societies of the South, so below the Mason-Dixon line. And when you think about what would public order amount to in a slave society, is almost always the policing of slaves. Now, if enslaved people are almost all of African descent, and the slave is racialized as black, such that even people of African descent who are technically free are still treated as quasi slaves,
mhm,
right? The pursuit of public order and the policing of blackness become intertwined and
mhm,
inextricable. You can't separate them. That is, to be a policeman in a slave society is to police blackness by definition.
mhm,
You cannot be a policeman and not police blackness. And not only are the police sort of patrols, so one of the arguments that scholars make is that police officers in the South trace their origin to the slave patrol in the South, right? These groups of white men who were deputized to hunt for fugitive slaves. It's important to remember, though, that these patrols were not just officers of the law, but that any white man could be deputized as a police officer to catch runaway black people. Mm-hmm. So what you have in the South is the deputization of the entire white population to police the entire black population. Mm-hmm. That is so powerful and poignant that not only does it survive the abolition of slavery, it actually almost expands after the abolition of slavery. And this is why, for example, in the US South, more African Americans are incarcerated after slavery than were incarcerated during slavery. Mm-hmm. Right? And so you have, ironically, once African Americans are emancipated from slavery, their interactions with what would become modern police get worse. And then when you have the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, to New York, to Cleveland, to Chicago, mm-hmm. those cities then develop a very particular way of policing Black communities as well. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is that in the context of places like the United States, and this might be a little bit of a radical statement, the murder of George Floyd was brutal, it was cruel, it was inhumane, it was vicious. But I wonder whether the term police brutality is the right term if we accept that police by definition are racist in the United States. Mm-hmm. Because if policing is racist, then that event of George Floyd's execution is not exceptional. Mm-hmm. It's normal, or as some scholars might put it, I wonder if the death of George Floyd was not a failure of policing, but rather an example of successful policing.
Wow.
And what do we do with that? Right? Then not just George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Alton Sterling, those are just the famous ones that we know about, right? But Eric Garner, this becomes, again, not mistakes, not anomalies, but the successful outcome of a way of policing communities of color. Yeah. And I just want to draw that out a little bit globally. The same country that has this history of racist policing of African Americans, you can find similar examples of this in parts of the United States with high number of indigenous people in the Southwest and in the Plains area. Similar dynamics at play, deputization of white settlers to police and execute Native peoples. Mm-hmm. You find this in Canada as well. But let's take another example of, in the case of the United States, the history of policing in a place like the Philippines, where Jim Crow authorities brought their same racist logic to bear on Filipino people. And if you look, there's some great work done on the racism of the kind of counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And they literally use anti-Black rhetoric to describe Filipino people as they're killing them, incarcerating them, policing them. We might even think and moving forward, the US presence in the Middle East and the ways in which, again, the incarceration and detention of people of Middle Eastern descent, people who are practicing Muslims, is related to this history of policing as a fundamentally racist act. Mm-hmm. Now, last thing I'll say on this. People who disagree with me will point to a statistic, so I want to address it. Mm-hmm. Whether you're dealing with incarceration or policing, sometimes, whether they're conservatives or just people who kind of want to play devil's advocate, they'll say things like, oh, but like the US also incarcerates a lot of its own white people too. Mm-hmm. And white men are also killed by police. Mm-hmm. And so this is true, absolutely true. Mm-hmm. the key thing to remember is that a racist regime does not only affect the people it's targeting. Jim Crow did not only hurt African Americans. White workers who could have benefited from unionization, they didn't have unions, right? Because they had the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. Literally, the Klan was brought in to break up unions. Italian workers in New Orleans who tried to organize were lynched in the same way that they lynched African Americans in the South. And so you will always find examples of the so-called quote unquote dominant race, particularly working class and poor members of that race, being swept up in these kinds of repressive regimes. That does not negate the racist nature of the regime. Mm-hmm. If anything, what it suggests is that those white folks who are on the lower economic end of things should embrace a solidarity with those people who are directly targeted by racism, and together perhaps they could, instead of fighting over crumbs and who gets arrested, they could find a way to build a society in which poor people aren't arrested, but in fact are given food, right? So that's one thing I wanted to address, because you'll hear that a lot when you say policing is racist. You'll hear a lot of people push back and say, oh, but other people are targeted too. And I think the key thing to remember is racist regimes often sweep up a whole bunch of people who weren't necessarily the original targets.
Mm-hmm. And so since we like to think that we are in a more progressive state now than we were before, how is it that police, even though they're no longer regarded as the people patrolling slaves, why do they still get away with blatant murders of people within our communities?
Well, this is something I actually do work on. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason this happens is that everything that was justified prior to the abolition of slavery or prior to the end of the colonial wars against Native Americans, everything that you could justify with race, right? People of African descent are not civilized. They're enslaved and therefore don't have any morals, or indigenous people are uncivilized, or they don't know how to respect modern norms. All the racist ideologies they used. You can't use them so overtly, right? By the 20th century. I mean, people still do, but you can't be explicit about it. Mm-hmm. In the case of African Americans, though, one of the things that happens, and it's true in other communities as well, is that everything that was once allowable in terms of how you could treat Black people is now legally justified when it comes to convicts or criminals. Mm-hmm. So you can't say, I'm going to police this community because it's Black, and if I feel at all scared because I'm surrounded by Black people, I'm going to kill them. Mm-hmm. You can't say that. You'll get arrested. You'll definitely get suspended. You'll get arrested, depending on where you are. But you should at least get arrested and suspended. Mm-hmm. But if you said, I police a community where there's high crime, mm-hmm. and I'm afraid, and in that context, if I see someone and I can't tell what he's holding, I'm going to shoot first. The Supreme Court of the United States, prosecutors, the whole judiciary has essentially upheld the right of police officers to do whatever they want to criminals and suspected criminals. Mm-hmm. Even though we have a Bill of Rights that says you're innocent until proven guilty, even though we have a whole set of constitutional protections, right? In practice, the criminal can be killed. Mm-hmm. The criminal can be policed even if they haven't done anything wrong, right? And this is where it comes back to race, if for various reasons, structural inequality, whatever, you can argue that, well, I'm not harassing people in this community because it's a Black community or a Latinx community or an indigenous community. I'm just harassing people because it's a high crime community. Then you can get away with it. Mm-hmm. And all of us, by the way, participate in this. I don't want to let us off the hook. All of us participate in this. Mm-hmm. In the sense that where you can see this is we all know there's certain criminals, even those of us who are like critical of mass incarceration or we want to reform, there's certain people that we all maybe there's some people who are better than me, but most of us
Mm-hmm.
still have this idea. Some people are so bad, they should be banished forever.
Mm-hmm.
We should get rid of them. They should go to jail and throw away the key.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see is in television and movies, there's this focus on the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And in focusing on that, it convinces even people in the communities that are suffering from police harassment and brutality that we need the police, or else we'd have mountains of serial killers all over the place killing people.
Mm-hmm.
When the truth is, mass incarceration is driven by the policing and prosecution of poverty and crimes of poverty, not serial killing, not the worst crimes imaginable. Indeed, feminists have shown, in the case of sexual assault, for example, the police almost never take it seriously. They don't arrest perpetrators. There's no justice for women victims, right? So this isn't about safety. It's about an ideology which justifies doing everything that you possibly can to a quote unquote criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And if that criminal is in a Black community, then they'll be Black.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how we have racist policing in ostensibly non-racist society. And the best, my colleague Elizabeth Hinton, who writes about mass incarceration, she has this great phrase, right, where she says that what they do is they evoke race and race-neutral terms. And you can see that with Trump now, right? Remember this whole thing he's doing recently with the suburbs? This is for my suburban voters. We won't have low-income housing.
Mm-hmm.
When he tells them, I'm going to issue an executive order rolling back Obama's housing policy so that there'll be no low-income housing in your community. Low-income housing, that phrase, is evoking race and race-neutral terms. What he's telling them is, you won't have to have low-income Black and Latino people move into your neighborhood. And this is what we see with the criminal. The criminal becomes Black. Criminal Black man, as one scholar defines it. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's a big question.
Definitely.
If we're in a non-racist society, why are police so racist? And the answer is you can be operationally racist without being explicitly racist in your goals.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So policing is operationally racist, even if you have Black cops,
mm-hmm.
even if your police department says, well, we oppose racism in all of its iterations.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they say that, to the degree that they're still policing, harassing poverty, and that they feel they can do whatever they want to criminal elements, it will be operationally racist. And will be operationally racist even if we reduce the number of people incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we get justice in the case of George Floyd, even if we remove individual police officers, the police department will still be racist until we address that problem.
Mm-hmm. So a big topic within the BLM movement is abolish the police.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
I have a bunch of thoughts. Well, first I would say I think there's two demands, and they're related, but they're not identical. One is a demand to defund the police,
mm-hmm.
and one is a demand to abolish policing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are police abolitionists, prison abolitionists, who embrace the demand to defund as a step towards abolition.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who support defunding the police who don't necessarily support abolition of the police. Mm-hmm. And I would say that I fall somewhere in that latter category. Mm. While many people I love and respect are police and prison abolitionists, mm-hmm. I have some reservations about that term, which I can talk about in a little bit. But I would say there are a couple things that I think many of us can agree upon. One, the police budgets can be reduced and money can be spent more productively on social services. Mm-hmm. Two, defunding the police is part of reigning in their power, mm-hmm. right? When they have enormous budgets, it's hard to actually, have civilian control over police departments, and we need civilian control over police departments. Three, defunding the police is also about demilitarizing. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have a police department. Some people have made the point, I agree, there are police departments where the officers aren't armed at all.
Mhm.
But if they're going to be armed, they certainly should not have military grade weapons and tanks and these kinds of things. So defunding is also about demilitarizing the police. And that I support. My reservations about abolition, I won't go into too much, except to say, as someone who studies this, I can tell you, and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has made this point in the New York Times, and it's a very important point, that demand does not have widespread support even within the African American or Latinx communities. So many of, while some, there are certainly vocal activists from within those communities, many African American and Latinx communities do not, they want an end to police brutality, but they do not endorse or support the abolition of police. And so in that context, personally, I'm a little bit less willing, particularly as a white guy, to be honest, to start making a host of radical demands that are accountable to no community and are in fact speaking over what communities of color are actually saying. Mm-hmm. So my own sense is we need to have a real conversation about whether the demands we're making are actually representative of the communities we claim to be speaking on behalf of, or if they're not, maybe those, my dear friends who are abolitionists, they probably need to do a little bit more work in the community, organizing people and having conversations with them to win them to that position. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure we should be advancing demands that don't reflect the interests of the community at this particular point, or might hinder our ability to build a broad coalition around defunding. Mm-hmm. But I should say there are people who are smarter than me who disagree with that position. Mm-hmm. Right? Some of the smartest people I know and read are abolitionists, and to be fair, what they would say, I think, not to put words in their mouth, what they would say is, the very history I just laid out about racism and policing means that it's fundamentally irreformable. Mm-hmm. And because it's irreformable, we shouldn't be demanding its reform. We should be demanding its abolition. And if we get something short of that, great, and we'll keep fighting. But they would argue that prison abolition is not a utopian demand so much as a radical demand that will advance the cause of material relief for directly impacted communities. I think I'm doing justice to their argument with that. Mm-hmm. I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. They're very right to do that. I differ with them on some of these questions of strategies and tactics.
Mm-hmm. I very much appreciate the fact that you were able to speak almost for both sides instead of just focusing on your own perspectives. So,
and I would just on that, I would say if one of the most eloquent, brilliant prison abolitionist thinkers we have is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Mm-hmm. And so if people are interested in that perspective, they can look up her writings and interviews and speeches. And I learned from her almost more than anyone else. So there are a lot of people out there that are doing good work on that front.
Awesome. So you spoke a little bit about the defunding of police. If this was to be carried through, how will this better affect our society?
Well, and here, this actually gets to one of my concerns with the abolition framework is that, actually abolishing police doesn't give us enough money, frankly. Mm-hmm. So, and if we abolish police, it's not clear to me that the corporations won't replace it with private policing. Mm-hmm. So defunding the police is an important demand because, as I say, it leads to a conversation about reorienting public spending onto social services rather than punitive policing. It reins in police officers and offers some form of accountability, and it can help us demilitarize the police. All good things. Ultimately, though, defunding the police will be insufficient to address the needs that we have in our communities, so long as wealthy people don't pay their fair share of taxes.
Definitely.
So I would argue that defunding the police ultimately will have to be connected to a broader demand for equitable tax policy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm new to Canada, right? And I love Canada. I'm very happy here and very excited. Um, and despite even all the problems and limitations of Canada, I'm building a home and community here, and I'm very happy. But I drove recently through a wealthy neighborhood just north of the University of Toronto, which I had never been to. And this is in the context of a pandemic, which has exacerbated poverty, a pandemic which has led to homeless encampments all across the city. And just 10 minutes north of our university are $15-20 million mansions.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me, Toronto's an incredibly wealthy city,
Mm-hmm.
but it's an incredibly inequitable city.
Mm-hmm.
And if we defund the police, but we don't rein in real estate and we don't tax the 1%, then it won't be enough, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
It won't be enough to provide social services. It won't be enough to support our school systems. It won't be enough to address mental health and addiction. It won't be enough to fix our parks and pools. We are going to need, I think we're going to need to radically rethink what the social contract is and how we pay for that. And so defunding the police, I think, is a great start. But ultimately, it will have to tie into a more progressive tax policy. It will have to tie into labor organizing, right? So many people are not in unions, and the unions that do exist are hard to get into and losing power. We need a new labor movement in Canada and around the world for gig workers, for Uber workers, for all care workers, domestic workers. There's going to have to be a real struggle for economic equality if we want to address the crime of poverty, which then produces crime, which then requires policing. Right? Because if we defund the police, but we don't address poverty, what we're ultimately doing is we will still have crime, but people who live in those communities affected by crime will feel like they have nobody they can call. And then, we end up doing something that doesn't necessarily benefit directly impacted folks the way we wanted it to. So that's I think defund the police is important, but it's got to connect to bigger demands as well.
Definitely. That's very well put. We only have a few questions to go through, so
let's keep going.
So do you believe that there will be a change in the policing system soon or in the near future?
I don't know. And one thing I know as a historian is that historians do well not to predict the future or to forecast, because I really believe that we're in a contingent moment, right? And what I mean by that is anything can happen. There's been an incredible political insurgency. There's also been an incredible resistance to that. Black Lives Matter and the movement that has formed around this question of policing and incarceration is heroic, but it's also a movement that's constantly being harassed, surveilled, and co-opted by corporations who turn Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter, into a kind of promotional tool or a PR stunt. And I think maybe what I would do is rephrase your question in my mind, the way I think about it. Not that it's a good question, but the way I think about it is, will policing change requires answering a second question, which is how long can this movement survive? Can it survive long enough to build political power and win? And I hope so. I don't know. Policing, and let me be clear, whatever I think about policing, there are people who work in police departments who are well-meaning people, often many times come from these communities, and they join the police department because they want to help. And they're, and sometimes they do, but there are a lot of other cops who don't join the police for those reasons, who revel in the power they have over people and are refusing to change. And they're protected. And so the question of whether policing will change, I think will be answered. I don't know the answer, will be answered by whether Black Lives Matter can survive this crescendo and keep going and building political power, and can we beat back the forces of opposition? And if we can do that, we can change policing. And if we can't, then we can't, then we won't.
Then how can we as individuals lessen the impact or our own sort of internalized racism within our own communities? How can we keep these in check, and how can we keep ourselves educated about what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it gets back to something we talked about at the beginning, I think even before we were recording, and that is, I don't know if we can outside of struggle. I don't know, and you see this a lot now with white people in America, in Canada too. There's a whole industry is propped up, sprung forward, kind of coming out about white people thinking about whiteness. And I'm not opposed in theory to white people grappling with racism, or to any community grappling with anti-Black racism, and to try to figure out the ways that they can be less either explicitly racist, that's bare minimum, or the ways that they can work every day to kind of reduce harm. I'm not opposed to that. But I have a real problem with this idea that we can achieve that outside of a context of struggle in which we're taking leadership from directly impacted communities. So to put it bluntly, I'm not sure white people can really ever deal with racism, their own or their communities, until they're engaged in a struggle against racism under the leadership of Black and other people of color. Right? You have to, C.L.R. James, famous West Indian radical, once said, the most important question in anyone's life is whether you take part or not. And to me, a white person sitting down reading a book about whiteness is not taking part. That's not. A white person saying, I want to, even...
Sorry, we missed a little bit of that with the microphone.
Oh, no, I said, even in some of these protests where you see, white Americans coming out in support of Black Lives Matter. Sometimes it's clumsy. Sometimes they haven't read everything. Sometimes they center themselves. But to the degree that they can listen and take leadership from other communities, that to me is more important, and I think will actually help reduce racism more than buying a book about whiteness. So I think and that's true for everyone. So anti-Blackness, as you well know, permeates all communities because it's foundational to modern thought. And every community has work to do within their own, every group of people has work to do within their own community about challenging anti-Black racism. And that should be done. But, and again, here I'm borrowing from, again, Black feminist thought and the history, particularly of Black radicalism and the Black radical tradition. And that is, solidarity is the route to unpacking our own racism. Fred Hampton, who was a leader of the Black Panthers, was killed by police, and many people believe as well, the FBI. There's a new movie coming out about him too, actually. But people forget that what made Fred Hampton so dangerous wasn't actually the fact of he had a gun. It wasn't the guns that made Hampton dangerous. It was the fact that he was articulating a vision for what he called the Rainbow Coalition. That Black Panthers and other Black organizations would bring Black people into the struggle, that Chicano and Latinx organizations would bring Latino folks into the struggle, that white people and white organizations would bring white people into the struggle, that Asian and Asian American organizations would bring Asian and Asian American people into the struggle, and they would meet there in the struggle and learn from each other and teach each other and forge a real anti-racist solidarity. And that ultimately is why he had to die, right? And when you see that, that tells you that the thing that's most dangerous to the system is when everybody who is exploited by this system decides that they're going to get their head together. And this is why the third world was so dangerous as a political concept, right? It's so dangerous. Why it had to be destroyed and destroyed methodically. The idea that the former colonies could carve their own, fashion their own future, and that, you know, think of something like the Bandung Conference. The people from Indonesia and former British colonies in Africa and the Caribbean and people in Latin America who had been ostensibly free for 150 years, but were still suffering from US empire and racism, that all these people could get together and articulate a new world of justice. That was what was dangerous. It was more dangerous than any, in some ways more dangerous than any particular armed rebellion, more dangerous than the most radical revolutionary thing someone could say. Just having people come together and build solidarity. And I think when you do that, it's not that it's pretty, it's not that it always works, it's not that everybody is already woke, right? If we were already woke, we wouldn't have to struggle. It's that when you struggle, you learn. And you learn how to unpack racism, right? Just as a personal example, one of the things I'm most happy about in my life, and I am thankful for it, is that in the work I did before I became a historian, I was fortunate to have all of my supervisors and mentors and bosses, people that told me what to do, were women of color. That's interesting. That's an interesting experience. Because one of the things I learned from that was, as a white guy in America, how to live, right, and work and build something under the leadership and direction of Black and Latinx women. And I think that's important. And I think if we as communities can learn how to struggle with each other, but also take leadership from, going back to Black feminist thought, pivoting the center. Around Black Lives Matter, it's got to be Black leadership. Around migrant labor, it's got to be migrant workers' leadership, whether they're from Philippines, Latin America, right? We pivot the center and take leadership from directly impacted people. Then we will learn how to, I think, unpack the sickness of racism, which has been deposited in us by centuries of accumulated exploitation. So that's my hope. I think we can do it. We know it's happened, and we know that the people in power don't like it. So my hope is that we can do it.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end this interview on. So again, thank you so much, Max, for coming in and talking about the police as well as BIPOC histories in academic settings. It was great to hear about all the ways that education can not only impact us and our futures, but our general communities as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you for asking the questions. We'll never get to the answers unless people start asking the questions. So you're already on the right track.
We hope so. To the Regent Park community, thank you for tuning into this week's show. I hope that through learning our own histories, we are better able to celebrate our own cultures. I also hope it helps us take a stronger stance for the movements that we are a part of. We are not the first to fight for equality, and we sure won't be the last.
Please do not forget to like, comment, and share to our channel. Follow us on all our social media platforms. And for more information, please check out our website.